Every one of these tables could say, I can go up to 1,000 pounds, but it's a very narrow window of how that can operate. It has to be centered. It has to be at certain heights. It has to be with certain accessories. Now, if you do have a patient that's 1,000 pounds, there's other precautions taking place. Okay, that is the 1% of the time. We really want to go back and say, let's go back to the 80, 90% of the time. And how does the table function as it relates to normal, everyday use?
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
This week on First Case, we are speaking with Brian Grant, Product Manager, Commercial Operations at Getinge, as we continue our conversation around capital equipment. Well, OR tables, a big piece of capital equipment, Melanie, and we're about to dive in to a pretty deep end of the pool when it comes to capital equipment and OR tables.
I'm really, really excited. I don't, maybe you shouldn't like geek out over an OR table, but we use them in every case. We use them all the time. And there's so much to know and so much to take into consideration that it's worth it to have the conversation. And Brian is really going to give us that overview that we need and help us understand the equipment that we're using. So it's going to be a good conversation. I'm excited to talk to him.
All right. Brian Grant is up next. Stay with us.
I'm Melanie Perry.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
A 17 Studios production, you're listening to First Case.
We are speaking now with Brian Grant, Product Manager, Commercial Operations at Getinge. And Melanie, I know this is going to be one of your favorite episodes because you have been talking to me in the background about OR tables for many months, probably the better part of the last year. And so we've got a great guest lined up. Brian, just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. And we're really excited to talk to you in this season of capital equipment today about OR tables.
Hey, I appreciate being here, Justin. Thanks for inviting me. Well, like you said, Brian Grant from Getinge. Been in the medical world for about 17 years, focusing on the lights, tables, and booms. So, just as excited as Melanie is to talk about tables, I have the same passion. So, looking forward to our discussion.
Well, we love passionate conversations about everything that impacts the folks in surgery. And Melanie, I'd love to hear from you. I have already, but I'd love to hear from you about, what are the common experiences with OR tables as we set the table for Brian today. And that was a pun intended.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, it's just, will they hold our patient? Do they have, is the weight limit right? Does this attachment go on this bed? Or can I put it here? Or do I have to turn the bed around if I'm going to use it? Or what if I unplug it? What's going to happen with the way we position the table? And I mean, it's just, there's a lot of stuff to know. And then that's just kind of our standard tables. Then you get into those specialty tables and those ones that are specific for certain procedures, and everybody hates them most of the time. I mean, let's be honest. They're bulky, sometimes big, hard to use. And then if there's something attached to it and you're trying to work in a hurry and you slam your leg into the side of it and you got a huge bruise. I mean, we just work with them day in and day out, and they can be, while it's an everyday piece of equipment that we have in every single OR, there's actually stuff you need to know about them. And so I think that's why it makes it such a great conversation, because it's almost something we overlook as just part of the furniture, but it's a very important piece. And so I think it's just going to be fun to talk about these tables that can be very frustrating, but are also very important for surgery.
Well, let's start with a design, Brian. I mean, obviously, Melanie just talked about some of the common areas where people are like, this is difficult. Let's talk about the design piece, because obviously, as the design changes, it's about addressing feedback from the front lines in general, right? So can you walk us through some common design?
Well, talking about design, I mean, tables, they come in all shapes and sizes. Some have humps, some are flat, some have, concave to them, some have larger wheels, some have smaller wheels. At the end of the day, we're really talking about staff safety, patient safety. And through this, we're taking a look at, the widths, the lengths of the table, the patient loads. We don't want to go through and have this IFU dictionary that says, here's your 10,000 things you need to look at in order to find what patient can go on your table.
So all kinds of different shapes and sizes and features, but what are the main considerations that are coming into play? Typically, you're going to put them into the category of patient considerations, staff considerations. Patient is number one, but when you talk about all the different shapes and sizes, what are you really looking at in patient, maybe demographics or diagnosis, or, like what position they're going to be in when they're having the procedure done? Like, can you walk us through some of the patient considerations?
Absolutely. So, I mean, you have a table out there. In this table, obviously, you have your general procedures, your supine, your prone, your lateral, beach chair, lithotomy. And that's your basic setups. And so people want to go through and evaluate, is the table going to be stable enough for us? Well, we'll talk about stability maybe a little bit later. But as we start looking at it, saying, what is the demographic of your patient weight? Is 80% of your patients under 500 pounds? Well, then we should really focus on that category. Unfortunately, going back about 10 years, the manufacturers came into this spec war. My table can do 702. Well, mine can do 710. Mine can do 800. How many patients are we looking at that are 1,000 pounds that could fit on a 24-inch wide table by 7 feet long? I don't know of any.
That's interesting about the spec war, because obviously the design had to change over the last 30 years for a lot of those same reasons. Just when you look at the demographics of the population of the U.S. citizens, right? That has changed quite a bit as well. Is that what led to the spec war?
I think everyone wants to be the leader. My table goes the lowest. Well, if it's laying on the floor, are you ever going to do procedures down there? No. But they want to say, I have the largest specs, or I have the best specs. And I think that's one thing that people get tied up into. So when you start talking about specs, they can go through, we will design this table to function perfectly in this one small area, perfectly centered with only these accessories, and it can lift 1,200 pounds. However, now if you move it away a half inch off that center line, that patient weight might go down to 500 pounds. So really, does it lift 1,200 pounds, or does it really lift 500 pounds? Is it articulation weight, or is it maximum weight? And that's what people really have to understand. Really, what does this table do day in, day out with a normal patient, a normal procedure, in normal position?
Wait, so the specs portion of this is not necessarily equating to functionality. Is that what you're saying? Or real world functionality? Maybe that's a better way to put it.
By all means, yes. Every one of these tables could say, I can go up to 1,000 pounds. But it's a very narrow window of how that can operate. It has to be centered. It has to be at certain heights. It has to be with certain accessories. Now, if you do have a patient that's 1,000 pounds, there's other precautions taking place. Okay, that is the 1% of the time. We really want to go back and say, let's go back to the 80, 90% of the time. And how does the table function as it relates to normal, everyday use?
And, our normal everyday use too can be so varied. I mean, I worked in orthopedics and we'd have the table face in one direction for one case and we'd be spinning it around doing something else. Or, I'd see in other rooms doing other types of specialties, they might put the patient to sleep with the table position where the head was up near anesthesia, but as soon as the patient went to sleep, the whole top of the table was spun around and their head was at the end, and they were doing, they needed to be able to work near the head, and so they didn't want it up near anesthesia, and all the other things that we constantly do at these tables. It's interesting to think that what we maybe know as the specs, or what we know as what our table can do, actually is only what our table can do for a very limited window. And then as soon as we start moving it around or shifting it off its center line or putting it in Trendelenburg or any of these other things, that maybe our specs change. And it really highlights, I guess, the importance of that IFU and really knowing what our tables can safely do so that we are actually taking care of our patients properly. That's very interesting. I never really thought about that before.
The focus is here, Melanie, patient safety. And so when we look at, tables, well, do we need a table that can go to 80 degrees Trendelenburg? I mean, there are tables out there that do that. Do we need a table that goes to 45 degrees tilt? Yes, there are tables out there. But you sit there and say, do they ever be used together? And people say, well, that's the extreme. I took a look at over 3 dozen tables. And it really came down to some interesting information. These tables span multiple years. But you start looking at what the average is of the tables. I mean, we're only talking about 32 degrees trend and reverse trend. Now, that is right on that borderline of steep Trendelenburg. So what is really needed? Is 20 needed? Is 35? Is 40 needed? I think when you ask surgeons, they say, I want the maximum. So if I put you in 80 degrees, that's the maximum. They're not going to be happy with that. And oftentimes when you ask a surgeon, what is the angle of this table? They don't have a clue. And so it's just perception. And that's why I always go back to saying, let's take a look at really how you use the table versus maximum specifications.
Well, it makes a big difference. If you pay attention to how you use it and know what you actually need, then you can have a table that meets your goals and meets what you need, not necessarily, all the bells and whistles that come with the marketing, I guess, but actually paying attention to the needs of your patients and getting what you need. Is that right? The marketing, that marketing fluff, I guess, if it's okay to use that term, just what it can do versus what we need it to do, and making sure we have what we need. Is that right?
No, absolutely. And that's where you come back and you say, how can we use the table? And really, where's that weight limit that we need? Is 500 pounds good enough? If you sat there and really said 500 pounds is going to cover 95% of your patients, then that's what you should look for. If we look for what type of procedures, obviously you talked about early on orthopedics. That's a whole different realm, and then you start talking about the normal of patient positioning in the room. People have all different philosophies on where they articulate or rotate the table. Is it away from the entrance door because that sterile door or the main entrance door is opening 10 times per case, 20 times per case, and they want that dirty air to stay away? Is it because they have devices that want to be positioned under laminar flow? I really think that's one of those things that people have to look at. Our listeners have to understand, what happens if you set up a room and it's not in the ideal position? What do you do next?
All right, so then tell me what. Oh, go.
No, that's what I was. That's where I was going. So what do you do next?
What do you do next? What's the answer to that? How do we use this table appropriately to use it correctly? If maybe we did start off set up the wrong way, what are we doing?
I think there is that. People have different philosophies out there. They say, "Well, here's my doctor book, and this is how he wants it set up." But even through all those discussions and through does it have to be away from the entrance door? Does it have to be anesthesia at the hip for neuro? Does it have to be for ENT? We're going to make mistakes. And so I think one of the things that people don't like to talk about is saying, if we're already set up and that patient is on that table, the sterile zone's there, and we have to move the patient. Well, the first thing I say is go back to your IFU. By all means, I'm not saying that hey, we should be doing procedures on a table that can move. But we know it happens. People know they've done it. And the question comes back to is it safe to be done within that instruction for use? And if it is, what are the procedures? Does that table have to be lowered to the bottom? Does it have to be in trend? What are the procedures? Because it's one thing that people never want to address, but at some point in time, they're always going to face.
I mean, we've done it before. I've been in more than one case where we had to, we, like I said before, we've either, had the patient asleep and we've just spun the tabletop around, but you got to make sure the base of that bed is locked and while you're moving it so that you're moving the patient safely. We've always been trained that if there's, emergency in the room and we have to evacuate on a fire, the whole bed gets unlocked, patient's on it and out we go. I mean, we know that these tables can move, and if we had to, we could move a patient on it, or maybe we have to move them in the room for whatever reason. But yeah, it's not something we talk about much because it's not something we want to think about, because once they're on the table and draped and asleep, we don't want to mess with that anymore. They need to stay put. And so I can see why that would be something somebody doesn't want to talk about, but it is something our tables do, and we need to be aware of it.
And I think, Melanie, one of the things that people are scared of, they're scared of the answer. So if they don't know they're doing it wrong, then it's sort of not that bad. But if you know that it specifically states inside that IFU, do not unlock the table with a patient on top, now you're held accountable. Okay, so there are tables out there that have, dry features on them that can help you move the table with a patient. There are tables and manufacturers out there that do say you can move the patient like this. For example, ENT. People come through and they say, well, we want to intubate the patient and then we want to rotate the table in order to do the procedures. It's a common procedure. Now, there are different types to do it. First way is you can unlock the table, you can rotate it. That's clearly acceptable if it's in your IFU. There's another table that can have a foot mechanical release on the floor. With that, you can unlock the table, rotate the table. And then there's other ones that might have to reach underneath the table and do this. But one thing that you have to think about is how are we doing this safely? Are we approaching into the sterile zone? Are we taking precautions for the patient? Is the patient safe on this? Is it strapped down? We don't want to ruin the integrity of the sterile field or introduce more surgical site infections for that patient.
You're absolutely right. So, and I think the big messaging that keeps coming across, no matter how we talk about a table or whatever we say, is know your IFU. Like, you really need to know for your table and for what you're using, what does your manufacturer say? What are the instructions for use, and how do we use it safely? And also not just for our patients, but also for our staff. Are there any other things that we've missed that we can really talk about our staff using these tables? Is there anything else that we really need to address when we're talking about the staff considerations for tables?
There's tons of items. But I think one of the things that the listeners are going to hear is they say, well, go back to your IFU. And then they're going to go through and go, well, I have one of these tables, one of those tables. Next thing I know, I have 20 IFUs.
Yeah, that's where I'm headed.
How do I keep that safe?
Right.
Uh-huh. And if you do a conversion, you've got to relearn all of that. Or what about a staff person who comes from another facility that used a different table? Like, how are you as a facility making sure that everybody is aware of the IFU, especially if they don't have an experience with the manufacturer table that is in use, right? That's got to be a challenge.
Justin, that's a great point. And that's why I brought up, where is that safety factor? What is the demographic of your patients? And if you sat there and said it was 500 pounds, or you said we're going to fit 800, 80% into the 400 pounds, that's what you look at. And then you look at the exceptions, from there. And you say, okay, these are the rooms that we can handle these larger patients. And you try to position it there. And so that is one way to sort of separate or segment out your tables on which rooms should be able to do what cases.
So how do you handle the educational side of it? Is that the OR educator's responsibility? Does the manufacturer have some responsibility for helping with maybe competency and education? Like, where does that lie typically?
It lies everywhere. I think every manufacturer out there is willing to come in service. They're going to be able to do it. But really, it's about trying it. It's about touching it. And so those educators, those clinical educators coming in and being able to say, just work with this table. Now, Melanie, you brought up some things like, what is the staff really looking at? And I think there's a lot of things, that we start hitting on. For example, how do you communicate with a surgeon? Or how does the surgeon communicate with others? If you have to articulate a table, is this, hey, push the red button, push the blue button? Those things help out in the facilitation or communication with the staff. When you start talking about hand controls, it's a whole nother topic, to sit here and say, this is how we're using this. But at the end of the day, there's a number of things that have to be done.
So one thing that when you and I were talking prior to this interview, we were talking about accessories and talking about staff considerations, and we put a bunch of different things onto these tables. And I want you to share what you were telling me, because honestly, as long as I've been in the OR, you blew my mind. And so I figured there's got to be somebody else out there who doesn't know this as well. But we were talking about accessories and the things we attach to these tables. Can you go into that and really talk about what we should be doing or not doing when we're putting stuff on these tables?
Just because the device fits in the circle hole doesn't mean it's validated. Okay. And that's the thing we all have to be learning. And really what we're referring to are the table side rails. Now, the side rails are really universal and they are allowed to hold weight, but there are devices out there that might apply more pressure to it. So in a general aspect, you sit there and say, if the product is coming from the same manufacturer, it's been tested and validated. However, if you're taking an accessory from another table or another manufacturer and applying it to someone else's table, it's sort of taking your own risk. Yes, we've tested it, but have we tested it to the same regulations and the standards? Unfortunately not. They are all made to sort of have that universalness, but we're not tested. And this doesn't come through to say an arm board. There's minor weights that go on here, but people go above and beyond. The great thing about nurses is they're going to get the job done. And that's what we love about them. Unfortunately, we just want to make sure they're doing it safely.
Exactly. And I never, for all of the attachments I ever threw onto a bed, I cannot tell you, maybe I shouldn't tell you how many times I went and grabbed, this or that from other tables, from other things, because that's what we needed. And I never once thought about whether or not that this particular accessory was approved for use on the particular bed that I was using. It's just, this is what we used. This is the bed we put it on. And so we did. Never crossed my mind that there would be an approval for those attachments for particular beds. So something more to think about, something else maybe to worry about, but to make sure that we know, when to use our bed safely, and the accessories that we're putting our patients, and the accessories that we're using on our patients during surgery, and that's also a valid consideration for what we're doing. And it just blew my mind. I learned something new.
With that being said, everyone looks at a table, and even if you say this table is set up to hold 600 pounds, if we place an accessory on there that can only hold 200 pounds, that brings down the entire configuration of that table. And when you start grabbing some of those accessories, you don't know what those weight loads are. And so that comes into some of those challenges.
So many things to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the reasons that we also have, this topic as part of our season theme on capital equipment is like there's a cost, there's an investment, there's maintenance, there's all the things that come with the purchase of capital equipment. And, OR tables, a conversion, the table itself is typically in capital equipment category on its own. But then a lot of times it's coming with a conversion, right? Like many tables, especially in new builds and renos and certain scenarios like that too. But right now, what's kind of going on with the table industry when it comes to cost? So like, tell me about market factors, and the pandemic from a supply chain perspective. We don't have to dive too deep on that, but I think people need to know, manufacturing, has obviously been impacted, and we might be on the other side of that. But can you give us just kind of a state of the market from a manufacturing and just market sort of state of the market for OR tables, and then we can kind of talk about, maintenance and other costs that are important too.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it short here for you. But, when you're talking about supply chain, it's a never ending story. I mean, these tables are smart, intelligent tables. Therefore, they equal circuit boards. We know everything what's going on with circuit boards. So there's inventory challenges. There are items on here for stainless steel. We hear about stainless steel and, the minimal, aspects to those. Then you start getting into the table pads. Table pads using oil-based product, foam, viscoelastic foam, high-density foam, standard foam. These all go into it. So they are such a precious commodity out there, and all industries want them. So as we start building these up, yes, supply chain is catching up. But one thing that is still a challenge is even shipping, trying to get the product. It just because it's available, it doesn't mean we can get it to the manufacturing. And that's the other challenge with supply chain.
Yeah, I do a podcast in our family of podcasts on supply chain called Power Supply. And there's been, just an enormous amount of focus on that because back orders, right? But here's the other question I have on the tables piece. When you're talking about a consumable supply, the demand on that, especially because it's, a per patient or per procedure kind of use, typically the lead time on those, you might be buying them in bulk quantities, but the consumption rates are totally different than buying a piece of capital equipment too. So like, what was the lead time or, how much time did it take to sort of get through ordering, a number of tables, for the average sized, OR? What was that normally like anyway? Was that a 6 to 9 month delivery time, or how did that play out even prior to the pandemic anyway? Are health systems sort of already accustomed to not getting it on demand, so to speak?
Everyone's been very acceptable to the lead time issue. But in most general senses, these ebb and flow. So it's like 1 week you can have, a lead time of 1.5 times. The following week you can have a lead time of double. And this is because these ebb and flows on these electronics and the orders come in. And that's the challenge that we have, is there is no consistency to this.
I forgot about that. The electronics piece is really the biggest challenge with lots of forms of equipment and devices. I remember hearing about the chip shortage being such an impact, and I don't know where we stand today with that, but that's a really good point. I wasn't even thinking about the electronics. I was thinking more about raw material supply, but you're right. It's the electronic components as well. So what about maintenance? What does that look like? And I'm sure you're going to refer us back to the IFU again on that, but what does that look like commonly, or, on average? How often do they need to be maintained? How are they maintained? What percentage of the acquisition cost should you sort of have in the back of your mind for annual maintenance? Like, how does that come into play?
It is such a challenge when you start talking about that, because if you buy a brand new table, and now you're talking about maintenance cost that is pretty standard. It's a brand new product. However, when you start looking at a refurbished table, then you start talking about it might be more prone to having repair costs. But going back to sort of inspections, what are you supposed to do? Melanie and I laughed at how well staff treat our tables and all equipment in the operating room. They treat it like a brand new, crystal ball. But
we break it.
And then they break it in the first 2 seconds.
Yeah.
But, with that being said, they take abuse, wear and tear. Okay, so we always have to want to take a glance over. Okay, we would say, let's look at this and do a really thorough inspection, once a year. But you always want to start looking for those small items. For example, is the screw on there, is it raised up and you can maybe cut your glove? Or is the phenolic top, does it have sharp edges? And so you should always do a glance over at least once a month and just sit here and say, hey, the outer perimeter is looking good because, a small issue can turn into a giant snowball, especially during a procedure.
I agree. And then one of the other things we looked at too, when we would check our beds before we would even start cases, is to check those table pads, make sure that they hadn't been sliced or been cut or were, got completely overloaded with fluid from a case or anything else gross that would come out of them. And, or are they going to be, is there something like a screw sticking up or something that might cause there to be a positioning issue? So lots of things to look at, even on a case by case basis, just making sure that these beds are always in peak performance, or are performance ready every single time. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about the pads on our OR tables. What are the differences in them, or what are we, if we're checking them, what are we looking for?
Obviously you're looking for cuts. Okay. We don't want to harbor any homes for bacteria or, precious fluids. But when you start bringing up pads, I think there has been a shift. Previously those pads were sewn together. Now they're welded seams. And so your older surgical table pads out there, more susceptible to having egress of fluids. But the newer tables out there have a welded seam. But as we start talking about pads, people come to me and say, well, how many different pads do you have? And you say, okay, what do you mean? Do you think 6 is better than 2? Or do you think 3 is better than 4? We start talking about integrity of the pads. I mentioned earlier, many of the pads out there have a high density foam on the bottom. That's so you don't bottom out. But then there could be a difference, a viscoelastic polymer on top. Well, is that is it just a 2-layer method? Is it a 3-layer method with a foam in between? We start talking about this. The thickness of the pad doesn't really matter. It's the quality in what's made inside that really holds the integrity of the pad.
That's really interesting.
So, Brian, we're getting pretty close to the end of the interview, but I feel like we're just getting started. So, obviously, there's a lot to this conversation, and you're incredibly knowledgeable and passionate. But is there anything that we haven't covered yet that is sort of like everybody should know X about OR tables before we're done this conversation?
I love to have more conversation with this, and I know we're short. But when we're talking about OR tables, I think there's a couple things you need to focus on. First one, you sit there and say, the accessories really make the table. So whether that's a beach chair assembly, whether that is a carbon fiber leg plate, those are things that you should look at. And where can these go onto your table? Do they have to always go on that normal orientation or reverse orientation? Why is there a difference? And a lot of people come back and they explain it to them and say, well, with the offset column, if you're able to approach closer to the table from one side or the other, it's better for the staff. And so I think we should look at that. Really ending with a couple things here. I think the last 2 things that people talk about is what's the deal with hand controls? There are some hand controls that don't have displays. Is that important? Well, displays serve a function. They tell you about the table. They might have programmings in there. They might tell you about the angulation of the table. But these hand controls come in so many different factors. Whether it is hand control that is wired, whether that's a hand control that's wireless, or possibly universal hand control that can be used for multiple tables. I mean, people are even talking about controlling the surgical table with the integration system. Finally, people sit there and say, well, can we control it with our feet? Yes, there's foot pedals. And so those should all go into the evaluation when looking at these tables. it's not just about the table count. It's about the accessories and everything else that comes along with it.
So then you've told me already as well, but like really good advice to give people when they're looking at tables, when they're trying to make a decision about purchasing new tables or anything they're going to be adding to their OR. What is it that you would really want them to understand and want them to know about OR tables?
I think the best thing to do is to come through and say, I want to trial your table. What better to feel comfortable with the table than to trial it? Okay, it's not about mine goes a half-inch lower or mine holds 2 pounds heavier. When you have that table in your hands, you can see how things work. For example, how does the table lock or unlock? Are there posts coming down? We've all dealt with unstable tables, and that is a patient safety. That is the staff safety. So when you demo that table, ask for that trial. Look at how does it lock? Is it stable? Put things in there and say, okay, if there's a failure, what's going on? These are all things by you touching it, playing with it, becoming comfortable with it.
All right. Last question. I'm just going to tag one more on. At the end of the life of the table, what do we do with this large piece of equipment?
That's a great question, because doctors, what do they want? They want the latest and greatest. And so as we look at this, more and more we look at landfills and waste. And so there are manufacturers out there that are already taking this into consideration and developing guides that go through and say, here are the components that can be replaced. And if we're separating them out into separate materials, all right, here are the metals. These would go to one side. Here are the plastics that we turn over here. It gives you a diagram on how to break down that table to sit there and safely recycle it. Because unfortunately, what happens is a lot of times they just get thrown away. They get thrown to the landfills, and that's what we don't want. Okay, there are items in here that shouldn't go there. Let's recycle the batteries. What type of batteries are in these tables? Are they gel, lithium, nickel metal hydride? We need to consciously take a look at that and how to safely dispose of our products.
All right, Brian, this was a phenomenal interview, but like I said, just the tip of the iceberg. So I don't know, Melanie, can we do a whole season on tables?
Yes. The short answer is yes, we could.
I think yes. Brian, great job. I really appreciated your insights, and I know you could go into so much more detail. Thanks for helping keep it high level and having some key takeaways for the audience. You did a great job.
Appreciate it. I'd love to come back and have some more conversations about all the other tables in the world.
That was Brian Grant, Product Manager, Commercial Operations at Getinge. And, Melanie, talking about OR tables, and I just realized that this is a far more in-depth conversation than I ever possibly could have imagined, all the different considerations. And honestly, I feel like we just barely got into it. Nice job of Brian to give us a number of, good tidbits on a broad sweeping number of topics. But I feel like some of these capital equipment conversations, we've been able to cover pretty much the meat and potatoes of the conversation, but I feel like we could really start getting into the nooks and crannies on this.
You really could. And for all of the equipment that we have in the operating room, and for all of the times we worry about the specialty equipment, the one item we might need for one surgery here and there is a table in every single room, every single case. And so we are using them all the time. And so sometimes maybe they just kind of get overlooked or forgotten about as important equipment, except it's one of the most important pieces of equipment because our patient's laying on it and they're having surgery on this table. And so using it correctly and knowing all the things we need to know is just vital to our functioning in the operating room. And Brian did a good job really hitting the high points. I mean, made the light bulb go off in my head a couple times for sure. But then also that was a good point at the end. Demo those tables, learn how it works, see what you really need and get what you need for your OR to make sure you have what you need for the patients you are treating. Just like test driving a car, get there, demo that bed, actually see it, see how it works, and get the product you need. It was great advice.
Yeah, I like the 80% rule on that for sure. That's going to do it for this episode, but we'd love it if you download the smartphone app for iPhone or Android because it's the best way to listen to the First Case podcast. We have bonus content for some episodes. We have everything sorted by categories. But if you're already listening to podcasts, and I'm sure some of you are out there, you're going to find us on iHeart, Stitcher, Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google Podcasts, pretty much any podcast platform. If you search for the First Case podcast, you're going to find us. We'd love a rating and a review while you're there. Share the First Case podcast with friends. Find us on LinkedIn and Facebook and get in on the conversation. We love to get your feedback. If you like this episode, maybe there was something that really stood out to you, or another episode, we want to hear from you, recommendations on future guests and topics. All you got to do is send an email to info@firstcasemedia.com, or you can connect with Melanie or myself on LinkedIn. Just find us there. Send us a direct message. We'd love to hear from you. And on behalf of Melanie and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Case.